Former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "The FDA Should Copy China's Strategy to Speed Drug Discovery." He talks about how China is gaining ground in the United States in biotech, noting that its advantage is cost, not science. And by cost, we mean cheaping out. Joining us right now is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's also a CNBC contributor, and he serves on the boards of both Illumina and Pfizer. And Scott, this was a really interesting op-ed that explained some things I hadn't understood before. First of all, back when you were when you were the head of the FDA in the first Trump administration, you spoke with China about this and were pretty hesitant about allowing their studies in because they were not very rigorous and really not up to snuff, right?
Right. Back then, what was happening was you saw a lot of U.S. companies licensing late-stage compounds that had undergone phase 3 clinical trials in China. And we were skeptical because we had a history of a lot of fraud and misconduct in clinical trials conducted in China. So I met with the counterpart at the Chinese FDA, their equivalent of our Food and Drug Administration, and they assured us that they had cleaned up their regulatory process and we ought to give them a second chance. And we did. But there were a number of high-profile failures, including one from Lilly that had licensed a compound from China that had conducted late-stage clinical trials there. And there was misconduct found in that trial. There were some irregularities found in that trial, and FDA ultimately rejected that drug. And what you saw happen was U.S. drug makers pull away from licensing late-stage compounds from China. What's happening now is that U.S. drug makers are licensing early-stage compounds from China and then putting them through clinical trials here in the U.S. And China has become very adept at following U.S. Western discoveries. So when a biotech company here in the U.S. discovers a new biological target and synthesizes a molecule to hit that target, China copies it very quickly and less expensively, and then tries to license those early-stage compounds to U.S. biotech companies or pharmaceutical companies, which then go on to run the late-stage clinical trials here. And the fear right now among the biotech community, particularly among investors, venture capital investors, is that the innovation being sourced from China is starting to hollow out the biotech sector here in the U.S. And so you're seeing more investors go to the White House and try to lobby for restrictions on these deals that are getting done, where U.S. drug makers license early-stage compounds from China and then put them through clinical trials here in the U.S.
Why are the U.S. drug companies licensing these chemicals or procedures or therapies out of China when we know China is ripping them off from U.S. companies who have done it first? Is it just China offers a much cheaper rate, so they're just taking the bargain?
That's right. If you look back 5 years ago, U.S. drug makers didn't license any compounds from China. They had largely pulled back from that market. And last year, about a third of the new compounds that were licensed across the pharmaceutical sector were licensed from China. The reality is it's just cheaper. So if you can fill out your pharmaceutical pipeline or even your biotech pipeline by in-licensing a few compounds from China, a lot of companies are opting to do that right now. I think there's ways that we can be competitive here. The Chinese aren't developing novel compounds. What they're doing is scouring U.S. patents. And when we make a new discovery about a biological target, they either develop me-too products, perhaps molecules that are the same or slightly better, or fast followers. They'll tweak the innovation and develop better molecules to hit those same targets. And so there's nothing novel about what they're doing. They can just throw more bodies at this because scientists are paid less in China. The other advantage they have is that they can put these molecules into phase 1 clinical trials much more easily than companies here in the U.S. can do because of the regulatory restrictions. So they can get early indication of activity. That's someplace we can compete with them if we reform our regulatory processes.
This is what I've heard from venture capitalists in this arena too, Doctor, is that they don't want to do trials in the United States because it's confusing. It's more heavy-handed. And the rules have been changing recently. So they'd rather go to someplace like Australia to do some of these trials because it's gotten too complicated here. So it seems like it's twofold. One would be potentially slapping a tariff on any licensing deals coming out of China to shut that down. But the other is what you're talking about, and that is speeding the regulatory innovative process here. What needs to happen on that second front with the regulatory oversight here?
Yeah, as I say in the op-ed, I think it's a mistake to try to put an excise tax or subject the licensing deals to higher levels of scrutiny to try to close them down. I think it would set off a global arms race and restrictions on the flow of intellectual property. I think we can make the U.S. far more competitive if we make it easier to put early-stage molecules into phase 1 clinical trials. The trials that are going overseas that you talk about, particularly to Australia, and that's a real phenomenon right now, are typically phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. It's very hard, or it's gotten more difficult, to put a new molecule into phase 1 clinical studies here in the U.S. The toxicology studies and the preclinical work that you have to do, particularly in animal studies, is pretty exhaustive, and it's gotten more burdensome here in the U.S. And so what happens is the molecules coming out of China have a competitive advantage because they already have that phase 1 clinical data, so you know whether or not they're going to hit their biological target. And in the U.S., companies that are synthesizing and developing molecules here are increasingly going overseas to run those phase 1 clinical trials because they can just do it more easily, less expensively, more quickly. So I think there's a lot we can do with regulatory reform to make that process more competitive by lowering the hurdles to getting into phase 1 clinical trials while still preserving safety of patients. You want to make sure that's paramount. You want to make sure patients are going to be safe in those clinical trials. But this is a place where we could be leveraging a lot of the data that we have around existing molecules to make determinations about how novel a molecule is, how likely it is to pose new risks, and how much animal testing we expose it to before we allow it to proceed into phase 1 clinical trials here.
You also described something in the op-ed that I was not familiar with, phase 0 trials, at least for small molecules, that make it easier, kind of microdosing things so you can do smaller scale before you would get to a phase 1 trial. And you say that that concept should be extended to things like, I guess, ASO therapies or gene therapies.
That's right. So we designed this regulatory framework back in 2006 when I was at FDA, which is called phase 0 microdosing trials, where you're exposing patients to very small doses of drugs, not enough to cause any harm, presumably, but enough to get evidence of whether or not a new molecule hits its biological target and whether or not you need to refine it before you proceed into larger scale trials. That was really designed in a small molecule world when most of the drugs that were being developed were pill-based drugs. And it hasn't been extended to the new formulations like ASOs, like mRNA, RNA-based drugs, RNAi, cell therapies, antibody-based drugs. And we ought to think about how we extend that concept.
Because gene therapy is like one and done, so you can't microdose.
That's right.
You get a one and done shot with that. It would work for some of these others, like an mRNA.
Yeah, certainly antibody-based drugs, which is the bulk of new therapeutics being put into development right now. So we ought to think about how to extend that framework as well. Once again, the Chinese don't have a technological edge on us. In fact, I think the science coming out of the U.S. is far superior, and what they do is scour our Western patents to see what they're going to develop. What they really have is a policy edge, and I think that can be mitigated.